Welcome, everybody. Tonight we are going to discuss the importance of being a mensch in marriage. So let me start off by asking you the following. What is a mensch?
Good person.
Good person.
So start with the general and move to the more detailed.
Okay, good.
It's like, I'm sorry, I'm thinking out loud.
Sometimes thinking out loud helps
Yeah.
formulate what you want
We're
to say.
waiting now.
A wise person.
A wise person, okay. Good. Kind.
It feels like honorable or something like that.
Honorable,
Like
okay.
You say it when somebody, not just when somebody says, like when somebody does something. Like when somebody does something that seems good and honorable.
Yeah.
Right, we would say, what a mensch, or
Yeah.
he's such a mensch.
Yeah. Like when they seem to sacrifice something for a higher good.
Okay.
But you hear that
Good.
when it's like for the perfect man. It's like, no, this is like a mensch. This is meant to be. This is perfect. I don't know.
Oh.
So you would use it not only for people, you're saying, but for anything that's perfect?
And I related with a guy. I don't know, like every time, like, no,
Yeah.
he's a mensch.
Right.
So I don't know. I never hear like for a girl, but I guess
Uh-huh.
it's
Yeah, you could use it for a girl too.
there we go.
But when you do hear the expression, what does it imply? When you say, oh, he's such a mensch,
Yeah.
what does that mean?
With a lot of like values and
Aha, good values. Okay, good.
I can count on him or her being ethical.
Mm-hmm. Good word, ethical.
But it does seem like a masculine word, like you said. And I wouldn't ever say a woman is a mensch.
A menschette.
Yeah. Well, now I learned something.
Is that what
new.
it is?
I think of a mature woman. Mature women.
Could be a mensch.
Yeah, I prefer
Okay.
mature women being.
You're right. Mensch could be for a man or a woman. In fact, the real definition of a mensch, like the dictionary definition, is a Yiddish word, is a human being.
Oh, wow.
It's a human being. So when you say about somebody, like you ladies are mentioning, oh, he's such a mensch, or what a mensch, what you're actually saying is, what a human being. He's such a human being, or she's such a human being.
Person, oh, this man, like, you know.
Exactly.
You know what they mean, like.
Now, it's ironic because the way society in general often uses the term human being, it implies a flawed being, a creation that's inherently flawed. So, for example, the classic excuse, I'm only human. You make a mistake. I'm only human. In other words, what else can you expect from a human? Humans aren't perfect. But Judaism looks at the term human being from the complete opposite point of view.
Yes.
That a human being is unique amongst all creations due to our ability to rise above circumstances, to make the right choice. In other words, we don't blame bad choices on being a human being. We are expected to make the right choices because we are human beings. Let's take a look at text 1 in your books.
what page is it?
Page 116. Okay, and
Mine's in my
if you need
car.
to share, feel free. This is all. You can share Valentina if you'd like.
Here, you can.
No, I don't want to.
Yeah, okay.
Anybody want to read? This is a text from the psychologist and neuroscientist Daniel Levitin, his book, or his article actually in the New York Times. So, any volunteers to read this excerpt?
Sure.
Thank you, Rivka. Go ahead.
Language and social cognition fall along a continuum across species. Deception, for instance, long thought to be unique to humans, is present in monkeys and crows, which can even hide their attempts to deceive. Counterintuitively, Much of what makes us human is not an ability to do more things, writes Gazzaniga, a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, but an ability to inhibit automatic responses in favor of reasoned ones. Consequently, we may be the only species that engages in delayed gratification and impulse control.
Right. So in other words, what's unique to a human being is the ability to control ourselves. Impulse control, put simply. And therefore, more is expected of a human being because we're able to do that. There is a principle in Hasidic philosophy that really expresses this idea. Some of you might have heard it before, might be somewhat familiar with it. It states that a goal that we would like to reach, something that we would like to implement in our lives, is to have our mind rule our heart. Have our mind rule our heart. What does this mean exactly? So, when we're faced with certain circumstance or a certain event or a certain interaction, we could react in one of two modes.
Intellect rules emotions.
Right, that's another way to put it exactly. Intellect rules the emotions, and we're going to develop this and put it into other words as well. Okay, so we could choose to react in one of two modes. We could react based on emotions, an emotional reaction, which will cause us to think a certain way. So that it would be our emotions ruling our logic. We first are feeling something, and based on those feelings, we begin to think something. Or we could react with our mind, our logic, and from our way of thinking, we will then feel. That mindset, that way of thinking, that logic will produce emotions that result. For example, let's say you're working on a project at work, and there's one little detail you're not so clear on. So you send your boss an email to clarify what exactly it is you're supposed to be working on in that particular detail. One day passes, another day passes, and you're not getting a response. Now, you could react with frustration, with anger. I'm waiting for this email. I'm stuck on the project. I can't move ahead. Why is my boss not responding? Then what happens? What does your anger produce? It produces certain thoughts in your brain. Oh, it must be because my boss doesn't value what I do anyways. My project's not important to him. He doesn't really care. Or he doesn't consider me a productive member of the team anyhow, or whatever. The feeling of anger will get you to jump to conclusions, and your mind will be coming up with all sorts of reasons why your boss is not responding to you, which will produce an action, a behavior as a result, which might be, well, forget the whole project, I'm just going to dump it. He doesn't care about it anyways. Okay, so in this case, this person reacted emotionally to the fact that he didn't get a response, reacted with anger, which caused him or her to think a certain way, which is not necessarily accurate because it wasn't thought through logically. It was just a reaction based on emotion. And then, even worse, led to behavior which wasn't very rational. Why? Because it didn't start with being rational, it started with emotions. Whereas, let's look at the same scenario again. You send an email to your boss, you're stuck on a detail of the project. 1 day passes, 2 days passes, no response. You feel that you're getting a little bit worked up, and then you think, wait, 1 second. This doesn't usually happen. Usually my boss responds pretty promptly. I know that my boss is happy with my work. He's told me many, many times. There must be a reason why he's not responding in this case. And then you remember, oh, you know what? I think there's another department now in the company that's in the middle of a huge project, and he's probably very, very busy overseeing that. So he didn't have a chance to respond to my email yet. Now what do you feel?
Excuse your friend, excuses why.
Okay, so you reacted with logic. You rationalized the situation instead of just getting heated up and jumping to conclusions. Okay, you rationalized it. Now, once you rationalize it, you have a certain way of thinking. That thought will produce emotion. So now you're going to feel something as a result of what's going through your mind. So what are you going to feel?
Understand that there is something else come up and that eventually get back to you.
Okay, understanding, acceptance.
Acceptance.
Okay, good.
That's kind of, I have an issue with this approach. Like, I always was like that, like by nature, and was always head over.
Level-headed.
Yeah, and I was proven that really what I was doing was ignoring my heart.
Ah,
So
okay.
it's really, like, I don't think there is like a...
Okay, this is a very good point.
Yeah.
This is a good point. I'm going to address it soon.
Okay.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up.
All right.
Okay, so you might be feeling now more understanding, more accepting, more calm, maybe, because you nipped those feelings in the bud by thinking first and realizing that it's not as bad as you thought.
It's kind of like giving someone the benefit of the doubt, which is always great.
Yeah.
But again, like, what if your intuition tells you that?
Okay, we're going to discuss all these. This is all very good. These are all very good points, and that's actually what this class is all about. So we're gonna get there soon.
Thinking not only like on yourself, like I need to fix it now because I need to work on this now. It's like, well, there's something about like also going on. So either I can go and try to be creative and come with something in the meantime, or just
Right. Okay, excellent. So now you're getting to the next step, which is action. So now that you've thought it through, and so your emotions are balanced and not running away with you, so now you're going to do something. Now, always what comes next is action. So having reacted logically, what kind of action are you going to put into play now? So maybe like Monica said, I'll work on something else meanwhile. I'll wait till he's done, the boss is finished with the other department and has some more time for me. So now we're talking about reactions, behavior that's not rash, it's not impulsive, that you're not going to regret, as opposed to when you reacted right away with your emotions and jumped to conclusions and made up all these stories that weren't really true. The behavior that resulted was impulsive and rash, and if someone would just throw away a project like that, I'm sure that would be regretted at a later date. So there's two ways to react: reacting emotionally or reacting logically. Now, going back to the logical response, your first response is rational. Okay? Your feelings, after having thought it through and evaluated the situation properly, your feelings might still not be so positive. And that's normal. You still might be feeling impatient or frustrated because, yes, you understand why your boss didn't get back to you. It's not his fault, and you're not angry at him, and you're not thinking he thinks all these things about you, but nonetheless, you have a deadline, and you're stuck. So you might not be feeling calm. You still might be feeling some negative emotions like impatience, frustration, whatever it may be. But the main thing is that however you act now, whatever you decide to do about it, is filtered through logic. It's based on emotions that were filtered through logic. And so even if you're not feeling 100% calm, and you're feeling a little bit frustrated, your actions will not be impulsive and will not be rash, because they're not based on an initial emotional response. They're based on emotions filtered through level-headedness. Now, Ayala, to address what you mentioned before. We're going on about the importance of rationalizing and logic, but where does the heart come into it? Let me present to you two different personality profiles. And I'd like you to think about which profile, in your opinion, and I'm sure you will all have different ways of looking at it, in your opinion is more conducive to a better quality of life, shall we say. Okay? So, first profile. You're going shopping. You're going to Target, although we're not going to Target for much longer around here. But let's say, meanwhile,
Walmart.
you're going to Target or Walmart because you need a couple of groceries. You need some cereal maybe and some eggs. And as you're making your way towards the grocery aisle, you notice you pass by the stationery aisle, or you pass by the home decor aisle, and something catches your eye, and something's on sale, and think, wow, this is so cool, I can't live without it. And then, by the time you're ready to leave, you're ready to pay, besides the eggs and the cereal that you initially planned on buying, your shopping cart is somehow filled with all kinds of other things. And you go home with bags and bags of stuff. What's that called?
Impulse shopping.
Impulse shopping, right. And you may or you may not regret that at one point. Probably some of those purchases you might regret because you didn't plan for it in advance. It wasn't thought through. It's like you saw it, you got excited, so you acted and you bought it. But there was no pre-thinking involved, whether you need it, whether you really like it, what are you going to do with it, where are you going to store it, are you going to use it, etc., etc. Okay? That's profile number one.
That's why I'm fighting with this impulse.
You're not alone.
It's horrible. I keep forgetting I'm alone.
Retail therapy.
But,
Yeah, I know. You're not alone in that.
I know.
Second profile. Take a professional, okay? A doctor, for example. A doctor is working in the ER, the emergency room. This doctor sees all kinds of suffering every day for many, many hours. Lots of pain. Probably, unfortunately, some people who don't make it. Now, in order to continue on and to stay sane and to do his job, what does the doctor need to do? He needs to detach from his emotions and just look at everything very objectively, clinically, as his training, according to what he was trained to do, and not to put his heart into it, not to start feeling for people, not to look at them as people, but as cases. And that's how he's getting through his job. I'm not saying every doctor does that, okay? I'm talking about this particular profile. Decide it, that's it. There's no feeling, no heart involved. It's all going to be clinical. Otherwise, I can't handle seeing all the suffering. Sorry?
Meat. As they used to say in taxi.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Now,
is one of meat.
which way speaks to you more in terms of a better way, a better approach to life, easier to enjoy life?
Neither.
Let's say.
You have to
Okay,
balance.
neither.
Thank you.
Okay, you're right. We're talking about two extremes. In the first case, we're talking about someone who is primarily living according to their emotions, their passion, their excitement, and they only think afterwards when it's too late, if that.
It's mostly
So their mode of operation is emotions and action, and then maybe thought. In the second profile, you have the opposite extreme. This is somebody who's operating in life primarily with logic, through rational thinking. So this mode of operation is rational thought, logic, and then action. No emotion in the picture. And as you said, Ayala, neither is good. And this is exactly what you were mentioning before, that we need to have a balance in life. We need to have emotions in life. Emotions is how we experience life. It's how we feel life. It's how we live life to the fullest and do what we really need to do in this world because we love it, because we feel it, because we're passionate about it. If we don't have passion, we might be lacking motivation, we might be lacking in growth, personal growth, whatever it is. But the key is the layers of the sandwich. What's the first layer? The first layer, our initial response to things, has to be using logical thoughts. Think this through. Then the thoughts will produce emotions, and we should connect to those emotions. Those emotions are important. And those are emotions filtered through logic. So they don't lead us to behavior that's rash and impulsive, leads us to behavior that's healthy, that's helpful, that's conducive to growth.
But not unfortunately, not everybody can do this. Like logically, it's true. You're right.
So, right,
But this is the
100%. It's
problem.
easier said than done.
Yeah.
And that's why in this class, we are going to address this, and we're going to look at some specific techniques to implement this strategy. Okay?
Because,
And yeah, this is important.
you can live a whole life and you can be
Exactly. And that's
no
part
logic,
of...
and then you realize, yeah, I was living wrong. I should do
Exactly.
this. I should do this. But it's true.
Exactly, and it's something that is not beyond anybody, you know, even the most impulsive person with the right techniques and the will and the effort and the practice, it could be done. And it's interesting because it was, as I was thinking about this, it reminded me of what we spoke about last class, about the love guided by respect. Because just interacting with love, it can get out of control, and it can lead to behaviors that are impulsive and rash and not necessarily healthy. But when we start with that base of respect, which is synonymous in a way with logic, because we spoke about how respect is that objective view of the other person, and that guides our love, then the love is healthy and helpful and beneficial to the relationship.
Exactly.
So now what I'd like to do is look at this concept, this principle in Hasidic philosophy of the mind ruling the heart, the logic ruling the emotions, at its source, inside. And you'll find that in text 2 in your book, on page 117. This is from the book, The Tanya, written by the first Chabad Rebbe. It's one of the most fundamental books in Hasidic philosophy. And so a lot of basic principles and central ideas in Hasidic philosophy are found within this book. So the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the author, he writes like this in chapter 12 of Tanya. The mind rules over the heart by virtue of a person's inborn nature. Employing the willpower of the mind, people can restrain themselves and control the drives of the heart, preventing the heart's desires from manifesting in deed, word, or thought. So in other words, it's normal to start reacting emotionally. It's more than normal. We probably all do it. But what's within our power as a human being, as a mensch, is to not run away with those emotions. To stop and think first and guide those emotions. So we end up in the place that we want to be with the behavior that we want to implement and to act on. And this is something we could employ, it's a technique we could employ short term, which is known as impulse control. You know, on the spot we feel like blowing up and I'm going to control myself. It's also a technique that we can employ long term. And that, when this technique is applied long term, that's when it's most useful and beneficial. Because it's like a muscle. It's our logic breeding emotion muscle. If we're constantly practicing stepping back and thinking before reacting, then when we come to a situation where we really feel like we're about to blow up, become a conflict with somebody, or whatever it is, it's much, much easier to automatically employ this technique because we're used to it. It's practiced. It's a muscle we're always using. And that's our choice, to be a mensch or not, to employ this technique or not, to react with my mind or react with my emotions.
I have a couple of questions. I hope I'm not...
No, go ahead.
So a couple of things. One is, I can see in this context how, for example, if you focus on a certain thought, for example, wake up every morning with thanking God that created you.
Uh-huh.
Your day is going to look different. Like I can see how that emanates, from the brain or the mind to the heart, and then you feel happy, and then you act on it, so I can see that in long term. So it's almost like positive affirmation kind of thing. I guess the part that I'm confused about is more with intuition. Like, where does intuition go into there? Because I think when we have the mind approach, or like the logic over the heart, let's say, you know, you meet someone, you have a certain, like, not so great feeling about that person, but certain things that that person says to you or promises you or whatever makes you, you know, think logically, oh yeah, that is actually a good person, and maybe I'm feeling that way, I have that intuition because of something else. And then you start rationalizing that too.
Right.
And then you end up, you know,
Right. Okay, I
doing
think.
something really wrong. You know,
Okay, it's a good question. It's a good question.
Don't you depend then on the speed of your response? And then that you have to train yourself so that you may, intuition has to be controlled by logic in order to function. So it's a matter of recognizing that you have a response, that it's intuitive, and bang, controlling it so that you do what's best with it.
Yeah,
But do you
100%. It needs to be with.
intuition, or
Well, how do
listen
you
to
know?
it?
I mean,
Control your
It needs to
response
be
your
in
intuition.
tandem with thinking things through, I think. But I also want to mention that what you're bringing up is in terms of making big decisions, I think, right? Life decisions. What we're focusing more on this class is how to behave in the moment
Okay.
when a conflict comes up, when something bothers us, a time when we're likely to explode versus thinking things through first.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about when we have a couple that's already in a relationship and they're required to act like a mensch, and how to do that. In other words, within, and that's exactly what we're going to get to now, within the context of a marriage, how to employ this technique of thinking first and then reacting.
Yeah.
When it comes to big decisions, I think it's a whole other category when you have to decide something, and then there's techniques that are unique for that, and I think what's definitely what Rivka said, intuition works together with logic. Sometimes also you need to ask someone else for advice. When it comes to decision, we're not always objective enough, but I think that's a whole other topic.
Okay.
Okay? So
We're
going
talking
back,
about the cap off the toothpaste at this point.
yes, right, exactly. It's the best example. So going back to being a mensch. So in general in life, in any relationship, it's obviously very important to behave like a mensch, as we gave the example in a work situation, right? If we don't behave like a mensch, and things spiral out of control, and we don't want to go there. But the most important relationship we have really is with our spouse. It's within a marriage. So if being a mensch is important in any relationship, how much more so when we're talking within the context
Friendship, like,
of marriage.
but marriage is more.
So this is definitely something, if we're talking about how to improve a marriage and how to grow within a marriage, we definitely need to address behaving like a mensch, how to behave like a mensch, cultivating our inner mensch, whatever step we're holding at the moment, and that probably fluctuates all the time. And it's interesting because very often people blame problems in marriage on the fact that they're not so compatible. The truth is, most problems in marriage are because one or both spouses are not acting like a mensch. So, for example, being
Tell me about it.
reactionary versus level-headed, being stubborn versus flexible, being demanding instead of accepting. That's really what's at the core of most issues in marriage. And, conflicts always come up in a marriage. We discussed that. It's inevitable. If we have the tools to behave like a mensch, the conflicts take on a whole different picture. If, when a couple's experiencing a conflict, the reaction of one or both is emotional, things can spiral very quickly out of control. But when each spouse deals with the conflict rationally, level-headed, thinks about the situation, thinks about both sides of the situation, whatever it is, gives it thoughts, then that could lead to communication. It could lead to strengthening the marriage. And that's the way that ideally conflict should be dealt with. Conflicts really have the potential to bring a couple closer together. And if we address conflicts rationally, with our logic, as Rivka said, ruling our emotions, then that will bring our marriage to where we want it, most likely. Okay? Now, if you think about all the different, and we just listed some, all the different non-menschlich, you know what menschlich means?
Yeah.
Menschlich means mensch-like behaviors. Behaviors appropriate for a mensch. So if we say non-menschlich, we mean behaviors not appropriate for a mensch. So if we think about all the different non-menschlich behaviors that we can exhibit as a spouse in our marriage, what would you say is a good starting point? In other words, which would you say is most destructive to a marriage?
Love.
Non-menschlich behaviors.
Non-menschlich.
The opposite way around.
Yeah.
In other words,
Yeah.
of all ways that you could react emotionally, which is non-menschlich, what would you say is the worst?
Misunderstandings, I think. No?
Sorry?
Misunderstandings.
Okay, what emotion would cause a misunderstanding? In other words, something happens and you react emotionally,
Yeah, you
and then
start
there's
to-
a misunderstanding. What was that emotion that caused the misunderstanding?
Anger.
Anger.
This one.
Good.
Yeah, it's the
Okay, so
anger.
you say it's anger.
Yeah.
Even annoyance.
It's a different
Annoyance
example.
can get pretty severe.
Okay, would you say maybe then that annoyance is a more subtle shade of anger? And like you say, it can get really bad. Maybe that means it's developing into anger?
Yeah,
Would you
it
say
can,
that? Yeah,
yes,
it can.
If you don't catch it.
Right. Okay. Any other
Selfishness.
non-menschlich? Selfishness, okay. You say that's the most damaging to a marriage?
Yeah.
One of the most.
Okay.
Having to be right all the time.
Okay. Having to be right.
One thing he's
Stubborn.
right, and he's the right person, and what
Exactly.
he said it's
Being stubborn in your position.
showing.
Okay, those are all definitely traits that don't do well in a marriage, don't help a marriage, don't enhance a marriage.
No, listen.
But-
In special, we don't listen to each other. This is very important.
And we're going to
This is
discuss
very
that also.
important.
We're going to get to all of that. So they're all good points. But I think we can say that the emotion, the non-menschlich emotion that we really should start with, that really can create a disaster out of a marriage, would be like Reza mentioned,
The anger.
would be anger. Now, you all mentioned really good points, real behaviors that are problematic in a marriage. So why would we start with anger?
So destructive.
Why is it more destructive than selfishness, for example?
Well, if you look at all the traits that humans have, like we need to live together, that's the one thing that would not make us live together well. Like, it can bring to violence. It's to be able to function socially, you have to tone down your anger.
Okay.
The anger comes
And
from-
what about always believing that you're right? What kind of implications does that, will that have socially for a person?
Yeah, but not as much as they would like kill someone because of that. Like
Uh-huh.
anger can bring to
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so
severe
anger,
violence, you know, like if
Yeah.
you look at the
uh-huh.
negative emotions like sadness, anger, I don't know, pride,
Jealousy.
like, all those
Mhm.
things, like,
So you're saying that
almost
anger, of all the negative emotions, produces the worst range of behaviors.
yeah,
Okay.
I
and
think
almost
it drives.
extreme.
I think it tends to drive, like as opposed to fear or sadness, it drives really negative thoughts. You know, like as soon as I'm angry, I start to sort of like come up with all of these reasons why I'm angry and blame the other person, and I think it just leads to all of those behaviors.
Yeah,
And it's
definitely
So
true.
I don't realize that like there's something else going on. You know what I mean? Maybe I got scared and now I'm angry, and so I just sort of like indulge my anger and all of the thoughts that come with it.
Okay.
and it feeds
Good
on
points.
its own.
It feeds on itself. Excellent point. These
Yeah,
are all
because
excellent
people
points.
who get angry with
Because
the
they're already angry.
they are. So they think they are the right one. They don't want to listen even.
Exactly.
It's like-
Okay. So I love what you're all saying, and it's all
Off the
very, very
logic
true.
button, for sure.
What about like, well, I don't know if it's anger, but sometimes when you're like not talking, but maybe having a discussion with this. It could be your husband, your friend, and you start making the other person like feel less.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know,
Like putting someone
Putting
down.
someone
yeah,
down.
like we're
Yeah,
two
yeah.
humans, but oh no, I don't like this part. I don't know. You start bringing things like, I don't know, from the past or from
Right.
something that, oh well, I didn't like what you cooked like tonight. Why again? Like, I don't know, like something
Right.
that it will make the other person feel bad.
Embarrassing. Like,
Yeah.
But
Or
again,
like I'm not enough like for this person, or what's going on, right?
Okay, good. These are all excellent points. I'm going to ask you all just to hold these thoughts for a few minutes, and I want to return to them and discuss them because these are all excellent. What we're going to do first, though, before we get back to all these points, is going to see what by now we know him quite well, is the Rambam, Maimonides. What does he have to say about anger? So turn to text 4, please.
He says he's right and you're making him
On
happy.
page 118.
But then after 25 years, he's regretting everything.
Okay, you have it, everybody? Page 118, text 4. And this is what the Rambam writes in the book that we mentioned last class, Mishnah Torah, which encompasses every aspect of Judaism. This is what he writes about anger. Anger is an exceptionally negative quality. It is proper to distance oneself from anger to the furthest extreme and to train oneself not to become angry, even in response to an incident that rightfully calls for anger. Now, normally, the Rambam adopts the golden mean rule, which means that the Rambam always advocates for finding the middle road, not to go to either extreme on either end. But there are 2 exceptions to his rule, to his own rule. One of those 2 exceptions is anger. The other is arrogance. But for our discussion now, we're focusing on anger. According to the Rambam, there is never a justification for anger. And we should go to any extreme to avoid anger. And do you all agree with that? Do you agree there's never a justification for anger?
The Rebbe and Rabbi Dabrowski both taught that anger is idol worship,
Mm-hmm.
which is horrific.
Mm-hmm.
Rambam also says that. Yeah.
Yeah. Equates anger to
Yeah.
idol worship. That's true.
That's true.
That's true. So you agree, never justified. Okay, I agree too. There's a good wife named Sarah, okay? Now, it's approaching about, 6:30 in the evening. She has supper all prepared for her husband, who should any minute be coming home from work. Beautiful supper. It's on the table. But minutes pass before she knows that it's 7 o'clock. She looks at the supper. It's getting a little bit cold. She puts it back in the oven to warm up. Another 20 minutes passes. It's beginning to dry out in the oven. She takes it out. And meanwhile, her feelings are starting to boil. Where is he? I prepared this supper for him. It's getting cold. It's getting dried out. Doesn't he care? Doesn't he care about the effort I put in? He's supposed to be home. He's probably out with his friends having fun, and he totally forgot about me, doesn't appreciate what I do. And the anger's building and building and building until an hour later, her husband walks through the door, and what do you think Sarah says to him? She probably screeches, "Where were you? I've been waiting for 2 hours. I had this dinner prepared. How dare you not call me and let me know you're going to be late? Don't you appreciate what I do for you?" And we can imagine how this conversation continues. It turns out that her husband was on his way home from work at the normal time
Got the traffic.
when he got an emergency call from a friend who has a flat tire at the side of the road. And he had to detour to help his friend. And meanwhile, the battery on his cell phone died, so he couldn't call his wife. And he tried to do this as fast as he can, to take the quickest route to his friend, fix the tire, and get home as fast as he can. This was the quickest he could make it. Now, what's happening here? So it's exactly like you all mentioned. This is the danger of anger. That angry feelings cause us to jump to conclusions. Sarah was starting to get angry. Where is her husband? So right away she jumps to conclusions. He must be out with his friends. He doesn't care about me, doesn't appreciate me. Once she has that thought in her head, what happens? She gets even angrier.
Yeah.
And she continues to think, he never appreciates me. Truth is, it's not the first time. And then she gets even angrier, and so the cycle continues. As you mentioned correctly, anger causes us to misinterpret situations, which just causes us to get angrier, which causes us to continue to misinterpret and exaggerate things, which causes us to be angrier, etc., etc. So what is unique about anger versus all the other negative emotions that are not appropriate for a mensch is that all the other behaviors like stubbornness, selfishness, inflexibility, whatever it is, those are generally the results of a faulty perception. Those are generally the results of jumping to conclusions. Once you jump to conclusions, you feel that the husband is selfish, you feel stubborn, you feel whatever it is, the negative emotion. Anger is not only a result of jumping to conclusions, which it is, it also is the cause of jumping to conclusions. In other words, anger is not only a behavior that's not menschlich, it also, in general, inhibits menschlich behavior. Because once it causes us to jump to conclusions, anger causes us to react emotionally versus logically, that will spawn all kinds of negative behaviors that are not menschlich. So, in other words, if marriage requires us to be a mensch, being a mensch means we need to react in a level-headed way, react with our logic. Anger inhibits us, prevents us. Number one, prevention of behaving with logic. Anger is creating a situation where we are reacting with emotions and not with logic. Then therefore, the very first thing we need to address when it comes to learning to behave like a mensch is an action plan for anger management. Okay? I'm going to ask you now to turn to learning exercise on page, we're going to skip around a bit here.
No, I'm not.
Page 120. You have a little scenario there, ladies. Okay. Page 120 in your book, you have a little scenario. I'm going to ask you to please just read it to yourself inside, and we will then discuss it.
129?
120.
The exercise.
The exercise, yeah, the little scenario there. That's right. I don't think this situation is unique to Josh and Jen. I think this is something that probably we could all relate to at one point or another. And therefore, as I said before, what I'd like to do now is explore an action plan for dealing with situations like this, since they are so very common in marriage. And they don't have to end like that necessarily. That's what we're going to try to avoid through the techniques and tips that we will discuss. Okay? Now, obviously, in a general sense, anger management depends on what we spoke of before, of reacting with logic versus emotions. That's obviously the general approach to anger management. If we would look at a situation rationally, if Sarah would have taken a moment to think about why her husband might be late, she probably wouldn't have misjudged the situation and gotten so angry. But within that general strategy, what we're going to look at are 3 specific strategies which really are all based on employing this principle of reacting first with logic and only then with emotions. And then behavior that follows. Okay? Ready? Now, these 3 steps can also be called the 3 Ps. So it makes it easier to remember them. Okay? The 3 Ps. So the first one is P for pause.
For what?
Pause. Okay, something's happening, there's a situation, a circumstance, an interaction that's getting our blood boiling. Stop. pause. Now this means pause our inner emotions that are starting to take over our rational thinking. And this might even mean to pause behavior if we already started to act on those emotions, okay? Take a step back and pause. Why? Because first of all, it's impossible to evaluate a situation rationally when our emotions are swirling and heating us up. That's the problem with anger. Anger hijacks logic. Anger goes straight to an emotional response. It just doesn't even allow us to respond with logic. So if that anger is filling us and we're getting carried away with it and we're letting ourselves flow with that anger, there's no room in our selves, in our heads, to even think logically, okay? So we need to stop those emotions first. Pause. So we even have room inside of us to think. No decision made. Even if you think you're thinking while your emotions are roiling, any decision you make at that point will probably, I could say almost for sure, will not be wise and will be regretted later. Okay? So, pause. Second reason why we need to pause is sometimes in order to rationally evaluate a situation, we need some time. Can't do it on the second. And eventually emotions do abate, so we need to give ourselves that time for the emotions to leave, so we're approaching something rationally. You know, it's a common piece of advice. Don't react when you're angry, right? Now, if you might ask, well, how? It's easier said than done. How do we stop when we're getting all emotional? So actually there's some good tips here. I'm not going to read them now inside, but I would like you to bring your attention to them. On page 123, you see there, figure 5.3, there are some very good strategies for controlling anger, which enables you to take that pause. So this is really the first step in impulse control, in being a mensch. The first step is, in order to react logically, the very first step is stop. Don't react. First we have to not react. And then we're creating a space where we can think logically. Okay? So that's the first P. Pause. Second P is for perspective. Has anyone ever seen, you might have seen this before, on page 119, figure 5.1. What do you see there?
Yeah.
Everyone, on the count of three, say what you see in the picture. 1, 2, 3.
Rabbits.
Okay, you just proved a very basic, fundamental idea. Great. I heard rabbit and I heard duck, both at the same time.
You know what I have to say? We were looking at it before. I was
It's
like,
a rabbit this way and it's a duck this way.
and Natalie was like, I see a rabbit. And I was like, oh.
Yeah.
Okay, so those of you who said immediately rabbit, are you able to see a duck?
Yeah.
Okay, and those of you who said duck right away, are you able to see rabbit?
Yeah.
Well, I saw a
Now
rabbit.
it's,
That one
The moment I heard rabbit, I saw it.
because duck has a big thing.
Now-
Rabbit is
The rabbit has the ears. Now, try this, ladies.
Okay.
has a little mouth.
I noticed when I look this way, it's rabbit. When I look this way, it's duck.
Right.
Was it supposed to mean
Okay, but try this.
something? It was not.
That's already really great that you could see both animals. That's a good start. But now, try this. Could you see the rabbit and the duck at the exact same time, simultaneously?
No.
Well, I go rabbit duck. Right?
Ah, okay, good. So you could switch back and forth really, really quickly,
Yeah.
but I would say it's nearly impossible to see them both at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have to.
So we're talking about P for perspective. So this is a very good illustration of the way we perceive things in life.
Yeah, I like that.
people always approach experience, the same event, the same circumstance, they go through the same experience, but will have a completely different perception of that experience. Right?
Yeah.
Someone will see it from a rabbit perspective, some people will see it from a duck perspective. Going back to Sarah, for example, right? She saw a situation that her husband didn't care about her. And her husband saw a situation that of course he cared about her. That wasn't even the issue. It was just like he was helping his friend and his battery died. It was like a practical, logistical thing, right? And sometimes we get so stuck in our perspective, it's impossible to see the other side.
Yeah.
It's true.
And definitely when we are looking at things from our specific perception, at the same time, we cannot see the other perception, the other way of looking at it, the other person's perspective. So when we talk about impulse control or anger management, here we have two people in a conflict. One sees the situation one way, the husband sees it one way, the wife sees it another way. Now that, okay, let's talk about the wife because it's a class for us after all, okay? Now that the wife has implemented step number 1, paused, now it's time for her to evaluate. 1 second, I'm looking at it like this, but maybe I'm not seeing the full picture. Maybe I'm missing a piece of the puzzle. Maybe the way I see it is not necessarily the way it is. Maybe my husband sees it differently and there's something to the way he sees it. Now, if that's the case, if at that point I realize that I am not seeing the complete picture and I am missing some information, then good, we get the information, we fill in the picture, and then we stop getting so angry because we realize it's not as we think and we're ready to move on. But what if you're doing an honest evaluation, right? You're not in the heat of emotion anymore, you paused, okay? So you're doing a rational, objective evaluation of the situation, and you come to the conclusion that the truth is, it really is a rabbit, the way I see it. It's not a duck.
Yeah, it's
I'm right. Then what?
then
So then you have to think about the bigger picture. Okay, I am right. My husband is not right in this case. But is it worth risking my marriage because of it? Is it important enough that this issue outweighs all the beautiful things about our relationship? Ask yourself this, in a week or two from now, will I care?
no.
Now, sometimes the answer, probably often, the answer will be no. You know what? I probably won't care about it in 3 weeks. And if that's the case, then you know what? It's time to just forgive and forget. He was wrong, I was right, but it's really not worth making a big deal over. It's not worth ruining our relationship. I'm going to forgive and move on. You know, communicate a little bit, maybe tell, how you're feeling, whatever, but not to make a big deal and the resentment and the dramatics and, ready to go on, ready to forgive. What if your answer is no, is yes, that in a few weeks I will still feel hurt, it will still matter to me, and that's valid too, because sometimes a conflict could create a hurt like that, or maybe a loss of trust, whatever it is, that yes, it will matter in a few weeks, it might even matter in a few months or in a year.
So this
Then what?
little piece of anger, another piece ruins your marriage.
Right. So in this case, what do we do? Because just looking at the bigger picture is not going to manage my anger and my resentment. So this will be addressed in step 3. Hopefully step 3 will be able to diffuse those feelings, the third technique.
Go to
Okay.
the rabbi technique, right?
No.
You have to
These
think
are all
what-
things you can do on your own.
Yeah.
Going to the rabbi or outside help is if we're talking about issues that are beyond a normal, healthy marriage that we cannot work on ourselves. But what we're discussing in this class are things that are normal, that every couple experiences, but don't necessarily deal with right, and so we want to learn how to deal with them properly. Okay?
So
Now, this is a technique within the larger technique of reacting with logic, as we said a million times, right? That we want to, it's a technique of what is our logic? What is our logical response? Perspective. Our logical response is looking at the bigger picture. And just like having a logical response in general requires practice to really be beneficial, this technique also is best used when it's practiced. It's best to have this technique under your belt before the conflict arises, so you can just pull it out and it's very natural, and you're used to seeing the bigger picture. Because after all, we know that life always throws us things that don't necessarily make us happy, make us disappointed, sad, angry, resentful, not necessarily anything to do with my marriage. If we train ourselves to look at those little bumps as just that, as little bumps, as just, life, and in the bigger picture it doesn't matter, then when we have a conflict in marriage, we're used to that and we can employ that technique pretty easily and naturally. Okay? Now let's move on to the third P. So we have pause, we have perspective, and now we have parts. Parts. What does that mean, parts? Let's look at text 8a. 8a, page 126. Okay, this is from the Talmud. What does the Talmud say? Anyone want to read it?
People do not see their own faults.
People do not see their own faults. Now, is there anyone here who thinks they have no faults? Who really think they're perfect and do not see any room for growth in their life? You don't have to answer, but think about it. The Talmud is telling us that people don't see their own faults. That's what the Talmud says. But, let's be practical, let's be realistic. We know we have faults. Everyone knows their own faults. No one thinks they're completely perfect, right? So what does the Talmud mean by this statement?
Maybe inside a situation, like inside an argument, you are on your side, obviously, right?
Okay, good.
Like in the heat of the moment. It also reminds me something I studied in psychology a long time ago. When we make a mistake, it's just like in social psychology. When we make a mistake, we usually attribute to the circumstances. If we do something awful, because the circumstances were like that, I had to do that thing. When we see someone do something really stupid, it's because their personality.
Okay.
It's just human.
You're
it's
right.
Not,
Excellent. That's exactly what I wanted to say. There are three. It's not that we don't see our flaws. We all know we have flaws. Okay, we're honest with ourselves. The difference is the context we put our flaws in, the way we look at our flaws, at our own flaws, versus the way we look at other people's flaws. So, on three levels. First of all, we look at ourselves holistically. We know we have flaws, but we also know we have good points. And we know that our flaws are balanced out by our good parts. We see ourselves in a balanced way. Okay, number two, we find it very easy to justify our faults, to excuse our faults. As you were saying, Ayala, it's just, I behave this way because of my circumstances, maybe because if I had more money, I wouldn't behave like this, or if I had better friends or better support, or we maybe excuse our flaws based on our background and our upbringing, or even on our personality. This is the way I was born. It's hard for me. Okay? We don't have a problem justifying and excusing our faults to ourselves. And number three, we manage to keep perspective when it comes to our faults. In other words, we don't get all heated up and emotional about our flaws and our need for growth. We need to improve in something? Okay, it's a challenge. It's an opportunity for growth. It's not the end of the world. I'm not defined by my faults. Let's keep things in perspective here. So, we know we have faults, but we don't dwell on them. We're easy on ourselves. We're easy on our faults. Now, the Torah tells us we gotta love every Jew as ourself. So when it comes to looking at other people, what we need to do is employ the same methods. Look at people in a balanced way, non-judgmental, keep perspective, but how much more so when it comes to our spouse, who, as we mentioned in the first class, is our soulmate, is literally on a soul level part of me. He is me. We are one and the same. So if that's how I look at my own flaws, I should be looking at his flaws the same way. P for part. He is part of me. And therefore, my attitude towards my husband and his faults, which everyone has, should be balanced. He may have flaws, but he's also a wonderful person. should be non-judgmental. So he has a flaw. Everyone has flaws, and there's reasons and excuses for them. And number 3, he has flaws. So what? Is it the end of the world? We all have flaws. I have flaws too. Keeping perspective. Here we see an example of how the philosophical idea of what a marriage is that we discussed in the first class really kicks in a practical way. Because we discussed how we're soulmates, and to be aware that we're soulmates, to be aware that we share a soul, we're part of one spiritual creation, etc., etc. But now we see that that actually impacts the way we relate to each other in a marriage. Because if we know that and we believe that, we should behave according to that. We're one and the same. I behave like that to me. I should behave that way to him. Let's go back to Jen and Josh. We just discussed a 3-point action plan for anger management. Jen and Josh is all of us. We all have experiences like that. How could their story have turned out differently if one or both of them had employed these techniques, had put into play, into practice, this 3-step action plan for anger management? So let's start with P for pause. What if Josh paused for a minute before he entered the house and said, you know what, I'm feeling angry now, but let me just concentrate on what I need to do. Put the anger aside. It's probably not as bad as I think. Let me finish unpacking, and then I'll speak to Jen and find out what's really going on. Venting would have been different. Or perspective. What if one of them or both of them thought to themselves, look, we planned this outing, this trip as a romantic getaway for us to spend some much needed time together. Is it worth ruining the whole trip in the very first half hour because of a misunderstanding that's so silly?
No.
Again, things might have worked out differently. And lastly, P for parts. Either one could have said about the other, look, he's really a great guy, she's really a great lady. They don't usually act like this. It happens, we're all human. Sometimes we lose control, sometimes we misunderstand. We're not going to judge, we're not going to make a big deal out of it. And again, things would have ended very differently.
And they're in a country house, like everything.
That doesn't hurt.
That's a good perspective.
Okay. So, to sum up a bit, in a marriage, we need to be a mensch. To be a mensch means we need to react rationally, level-headed. In order to react level-headed, we need to have a strategy to deal with anger. And the way to deal with anger is through stopping and giving pause, through examining your perspective and looking at the bigger picture. And if that doesn't work, as we said, sometimes looking at it as a small, insignificant blip doesn't work because it is not insignificant, well, then we have number 3, we have parts, that even if something happened that was so hurtful to you, if we look at it as if it was me who did it, then our feelings might be a little bit different, and our actions would reflect that, and our actions wouldn't be so harmful and damaging to the marriage. Now, I'd like to end with one more concept. Are we still good with time? Yeah? Okay. Until now, we've spoken about how to avoid the key non-menschlich behavior, which is anger. But in Judaism, there's actually a concept when we talk about our relationship with God, with the mitzvot. There are things that we shouldn't do, things that God does not want us to do. Those are the negative mitzvot, as we call them, 365 negative mitzvot. And then there are the things that God wants us to do, which are the positive mitzvot. That's with our relationship with God. And this is something that applies to us down here in our relationship between human beings, and of course in a marriage as well. That there is a behavior that is not acceptable for a mensch, which we want to learn how to steer clear of, which we did with anger management. And on the other hand, there is also a very positive menschlich behavior that we would like to cultivate. And that is gratitude. And it's interesting because in many ways, anger and gratitude are complete opposites. Okay, think about it. Imagine if your husband regularly, consistently thanked you for little things, for supper, complimented you on it, for being such a good mother, for you finished your report at work, he knew you were struggling with it, and he did it, and he complimented you, and he appreciated that you followed through with it. Whatever it is, little things. Your husband consistently shows that he values you, that he appreciates you, and he expresses his thanks and his gratitude regularly.
It's a blessing.
Then a conflict arises, like normal. That conflict is framed by the gratitude. Because if you feel secure that your husband does appreciate you, you're not going to take a little incident out of proportion. You're not going to feel like, oh, this means my husband couldn't care less about me, my husband doesn't appreciate me, my husband doesn't value me, et cetera, which is the kind of thoughts that tend, the jumping to conclusions that we tend to do when we get angry. Because we know that's not true. It's so reinforced in our life. That gratitude in my life, that consistent gratitude, frames every interaction between myself and my husband and really puts things in the proper perspective and prevents me from overreacting, jumping to conclusions, reacting emotionally. And of course, if I behave that way to my husband, it's exactly the same thing. If I'm consistently expressing gratitude for every little thing my husband does, took out the garbage, I say thank you. He cleared his plate, I say thank you. He paid the bills, I say thank you. He brought home a paycheck, I say thank you. Whatever it is, my husband is secure. He knows that I value what he does. He knows I respect him. He knows I appreciate him. That if I make a mistake from time to time and it seems like I don't, he'll take it in the right context. It's interesting that, I said that anger and gratitude are opposites in many ways. Anger is not just a non-menschlich behavior in its own, it actually inhibits menschlich behavior, as we mentioned. And gratitude is not just a menschlich behavior, which of course it is, but gratitude also empowers menschlich behavior.
I think
Okay.
it's very important not forget the target. Like our target, Shalom Bay. And what we can do for maybe
Exactly.
when we act, just judge.
That's right. Keep perspective. That's right. And it's interesting that you say that, because just like anger, we said that the general strategy for managing anger is to react logically, right? And then we said there's the specific strategies that fit into that category. It's the same thing with gratitude. That gratitude also, in general, is based on this concept of reacting logically, of thinking logically versus emotionally. Because, let's face it, it's easy to thank the checkout person in the supermarket, and it's easy to thank cleaning lady, and it's easy to thank the bus driver. But for some reason, even though actually, gratefulness is in the Jewish DNA, by the way. Someone mentioned about prayers. You mentioned about Moda'ani. We start the day thanking God for what we have. And we say it all the time in our prayers. And in fact, the Hebrew word for Jew is, anyone know? Yehudi, which comes from Hoda'ah, acknowledgement, appreciation, Todah, thank you. Okay, it's in our DNA. We're used to thanking, but when it comes to the people who most deserve a thank you in our life, like our spouse, somehow it doesn't happen. And that's why I say this is also based on thinking, on choosing your response, choosing a logical response versus an emotional response. Because why do we somehow forget to thank our spouse? Well, it could be maybe we feel entitled. He's supposed to. Yeah, he's supposed to take out the garbage. I have to thank him, right? Or we get so busy with our lives that thanking on a daily basis sort of gets forgotten, right? Or maybe it's because we know him so well that we feel like he does all these things wrong and I'm supposed to thank him for that one little thing he did right. Now, those are all excuses on an emotional level, because if we're rational, we'll realize that actually there's plenty to appreciate. And that might not be my initial reaction. My initial reaction might be like many people to not thank my spouse because either I feel entitled or I don't feel he deserves it or whatever it is. But rationally, of course he deserves my thanks. And rationally, if I make a point of thanking him, that could only enhance my marriage because it empowers both of us to be menschlich, and it breeds more and more menschlich behavior within the marriage. And not only that, but, you know, sometimes we really don't feel grateful. Sometimes there's a marriage that's really going through a rough patch. And even when we're thinking logically and we understand the importance of gratitude in the marriage, we can't really bring ourselves to feel it. And again, this would be another case where we have a choice. We have a choice to say, well, if I don't feel it, I understand it's important, but I don't feel it, I can't do it. Or we can choose to be a mensch and to decide, I'm going to act grateful anyways, because it's that important. I'm going to rise above my feelings now. It really doesn't feel natural for me to show gratitude. I'm going to do it anyways, because you know what tends to happen is that when we act a certain way, it unearths those feelings that are really sometimes buried very, very deep inside. And so if we just express gratitude through actions, saying a thank you or a little gift, or however we tend to express our appreciation, if we at least start with that, that means we're choosing to be a mensch, and eventually we'll feel it as well. So to conclude, to be a better half in marriage, to be a better spouse, is to be a mensch. And to be a mensch means to make the right choice. Am I going to be reactive, or am I going to be level-headed when situations come up? And this can be expressed in two ways. In making choices to stay away from behavior that's not befitting a mensch, or to make choices to choose behavior, positive behavior, that is expected of a mensch. And we chose specifically to focus on anger and gratitude as examples of a behavior to stay away from and a behavior to concentrate on. Because like we said, anger is not only a non-menschlich behavior, but in general, it inhibits menschlich behavior, so that's a good starting point. And gratitude, exactly the same thing, but the other way around. It's not only a positive behavior that will enhance a marriage, but it also empowers us to continue with other forms of behavior that are positive, that are menschlich, that enhance our marriage and frame all the different interactions between us and our spouse. For example, let's say you're working on a project at work. And there's one little detail you're not so clear on. So you send your boss an email to clarify what exactly it is you're supposed to be working on in that particular detail. One day passes, another day passes, and you're not getting a response. Now, you could react with frustration, with anger. I'm waiting for this email. I'm stuck on the project. I can't move ahead. Why is my boss not responding? Then what happens? What does your anger produce? It produces certain thoughts in your brain. Oh, it must be because my boss doesn't value what I do anyways. My project's not important to him. He doesn't really care. Or he doesn't consider me a productive member of the team anyhow, or whatever. The feeling of anger will get you to jump to conclusions, and your mind will be coming up with all sorts of reasons why your boss is not responding to you, which will produce an action, a behavior as a result, which might be, well, forget the whole project, I'm just going to dump it. He doesn't care about it anyways. Okay, so in this case, this person reacted emotionally to the fact that he didn't get a response, reacted with anger, which caused him or her to think a certain way, which is not necessarily accurate because it wasn't thought through logically. It was just a reaction based on emotion. And then, even worse, led to behavior which wasn't very rational. Why? Because it didn't start with
Or her being ethical.
Good word, ethical.
But it does seem like a masculine word, like you you said. And I wouldn't ever say a woman is a mensch.
A manchette.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Okay, well, now I learned something.
Is that what
new.
it is?
I think of a mature woman, mature women.
Could be a mensch.
Yeah, I prefer
Okay.
mature women being.
You're right. Mensch could be for a man or a woman. In fact, the real definition of a mensch, like the dictionary definition, is a Yiddish word, is a human being.
Oh, wow.
It's a human being. So when you say about somebody, like you ladies are mentioning, oh, he's such a mensch, or what a mensch, what you're actually saying is, what a human being. He's such a human being, or she's such a human being.
Person, oh, this man, like, you know.
Exactly.
You know what they mean, like.
Now, it's ironic because the way society in general often uses the term human being, it implies a flawed being, a creation that's inherently flawed. So, for example, the classic excuse, I'm only human. You make a mistake. I'm only human. In other words, what else can you expect from a human? Humans aren't perfect. But Judaism looks at the term human being from the complete opposite point of view. That a human being is unique amongst all creations due to our ability to rise above circumstances, to make the right choice. Welcome, everybody. Tonight we are going to discuss the importance of being a mensch in marriage. So let me start off by asking you the following. What is a mensch?
Good person.
Good person.
So start
Okay.
with the general and move to the more detailed.
Okay, good.
It's like, I'm sorry, I'm thinking out loud.
Sometimes thinking out loud helps
Yeah.
formulate what you want
We're
to say.
waiting now.
A wise person.
A wise person, okay. Good. Kind.
It feels like honorable or something like that.
Honorable,
Like
okay.
You say it when somebody, not just when somebody says, like when somebody does something. Like when somebody does something that seems good and honorable.
Yeah.
Right, we would say, what a mensch, or
Yeah.
he's such a mensch.
Yeah, like when they seem to sacrifice something for a higher good.
Okay.
But you hear that
Good.
when it's like for the perfect man. It's like, no, this is like a mensch. This is meant to be. This is perfect. I don't know why.
Oh.
So you would use it not only for people, you're saying, but for
Yeah.
anything that's perfect?
And I related with a guy. I don't know, like every time, like, no,
Yeah.
he's a mensch.
Right.
So I don't know. I never hear like for a girl, but I guess it's
Yeah, you could use it for a girl too.
Oh my God.
But when you do hear the expression, what does it imply? When you would say, oh, he's such a mensch,
Yeah.
what does that mean?
With a lot of like values and
Aha, good values. Okay, good.
I can count on him being him.
In other words, we don't blame bad choices on being a human being. We are expected to make the right choices because we are human beings. Let's take a look at text 1 in your books.
What page is it?
Page 116.
I'm all relying on you.
Okay, and
Mine's in my
if you
car.
need to share, feel free. This is all. You can share Valentina if you'd like.
Sure.
No, I don't want to.
Yeah, okay.
Anybody want to read? This is a text from the psychologist and neuroscientist Daniel Levitin, from his book, or his article actually in the New York Times. So, any volunteers to read this excerpt?
Sure.
Thank you, Rivka. Go ahead.
Language and social cognition fall along a continuum across species. Deception, for instance, long thought to be unique to humans, is present in monkeys and crows, which can even hide their attempts to deceive. Counterintuitively, Much of what makes us human is not an ability to do more things, writes Gazzaniga, a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, but an ability to inhibit automatic responses in favor of reasoned ones. Consequently, we may be the only species that engages in delayed gratification and impulse control.
Right. So in other words, what's unique to a human being is the ability to control ourselves. Impulse control, put simply. And therefore, more is expected of a human being because we're able to do that. There is a principle in Hasidic philosophy that really expresses this idea. Some of you might have heard it before, might be somewhat familiar with it. It states that a goal that we would like to reach, something that we would like to implement in our lives, is to have our mind rule our heart. Have our mind rule our heart. What does this mean exactly? So, when we're faced with certain circumstance or a certain event or a certain interaction, we could react in one of two modes.
Intellect rules emotions.
Right, that's another way to put it exactly. Intellect rules the emotions, and we're going to develop this and put it into other words as well. Okay, so we could choose to react in one of two modes. We could react based on emotions, an emotional reaction, which will cause us to think a certain way. So that it would be our emotions ruling our logic. We first are feeling something, and based on those feelings, we begin to think something. Or we could react with our mind, our logic, and from our way of thinking, we will then feel. That mindset, that way of thinking, that logic will produce emotions that result.